All right, here we go. Today we're going to continue working on solving those equations. Remember, this is kind of a big, massive thing that we need to learn and get really comfortable with. That's why we're spending so much time and looking at so many different examples. So really today we're going to solve some multi-step equations. And I'm also going to give you some information to help you with any equation ever. So in our next little spot in our notes, we're going to be looking at the do/undo method. Okay, so you need to go ahead and get this paper out, and we are going to like fold it and cut it and make it flippy. Okay, so this is our do/undo method. So oftentimes we're given an equation here, and we know it's an equation because I have that equal sign, and it said, okay, so now evaluate it or solve it. So that's the do part, and that's what we're going to look at first. So if I was to do this equation, I would start with my x, right? So I'm going to have do, and I'm going to have my little line to tell us what we end up with. So I would start with x. When I'm doing an equation, I start with that x, okay? So what I have is I have x. The next thing I see is I have these parentheses, so the next thing that I would do with this equation is I would add 7. Okay? So then again, the next step is if I have that, well, I see I'm multiplying by 5. So I end up with my 5 times x plus 7. The next step, if I was doing this equation, I would then divide by 3. And then I'm told here that I would end with 20, because that's what's on that side. So I would end with 20. So I have 5 times x plus 7 divided by 3 equals 20. Well, so now what if I'm going to be undoing this equation? Okay, so how would I undo this? So that's where we're going to look at this inside. Okay, so here's our undo part. And when we're undoing, we're going to be kind of going this way because we end up with these same things. And that's where we're going to work here. So what we can go ahead and do is we can kind of use our same guide here, except we're working upwards. Okay, so when I'm undoing, I see I start with 20. Because that's the thing that's all by itself on the one side of the equal sign. So I'm starting with that. So the next step when I'm undoing this problem in this equation would be to multiply both sides by 3. So I would end up with, on the left side, 5 times x plus 7 equals 60. Okay? Because that 20 times 3 would be 60. So now my next step when I'm undoing would be to divide by 5. So I would end up with my x plus 7 on the left side, and 60 divided by 5 is 12. So I see my next step in undoing would be to subtract 7. So I end up with x equals 5. And so that's where I end with 5. So you can see I used the same equation. So sometimes I'm given some information. I would start with my x and then add 7 to it and then multiply it and then divide it and then get my final answer. But when we're solving, we really are undoing all these things. So I start with my final answer and then I multiply and then I divide and then I subtract and then I end up with what I was really given. Okay, so we can use both of those ways, going backwards and forwards, to kind of get where we need to go. So I'm going to go ahead and glue this in. All right, there we go. So now we're really going to be looking at, okay, so what happens when I have just any type of equation? We're going to be really looking at all of our steps to kind of solve any type of equation. So on the next page, this is the one that we're going to be using. And I'm going to go ahead and label my page of my notebook so I know what I'm looking at when I go back and flip through it. So I'm going to say steps to solving equations. And I always abbreviate my equations as EQN. So if you want to get in that too, you can. As long as you know what you're talking about with your abbreviations, go for it. So I'm going to glue this in so we can get working and look at our steps. So this little piece of paper, this little yellow one's probably going to be the most useful piece that we deal with during this whole unit and solving equations, okay? So the equation that we're really going to be looking at here. And I'm going to use different colors, but that's just because I'm a color person. Is here here's my equation that we're going to start with. I've got 4 times the quantity x minus 3 minus 4 equals, and that's how we know it's an equation because I have that equal sign, 8 times 1/2 x plus 2 plus 2x. Okay, so that's kind of a big, long, funky equation. So now we're going to follow our steps. And we see that the first step we have to do is the distributive property. So when I'm doing the distributive property, I take everything that's outside the parentheses and multiply it towards everything that's inside the parentheses. So here, I'm going to multiply, so I end up with 4x minus 12 minus 4, because that 4 I just carry down. And I see I also have the distributive property on the right side as well. So 8 times 1/2 x gives me 4x. 8 times 2 is 16. And I have that 2x. Okay. So that's the first step. I've gone ahead and I've gotten rid of my parentheses by using the distributive property. So you'll see the second step is to combine like terms that are on the same side. Okay, so here, the like terms that are on the same side is I see I have that negative 12 and negative 4 that are the same. They don't have an x. So I have now my 4x, negative 12 minus 4 is negative 16, equals, the things I can combine here is I see I have this 4x and I have this 2x, so they both have an x. So let's combine them. So I now have 6x plus 16. Okay, so now my next step is to move the variables to the same side. And it really doesn't matter which side you move the variables to, but I'm going to move mine to the right side because this one was bigger to start with. So let's go ahead and do that. But you really can do either way. We'll just end up with fewer negatives if we move to the big side. So I know to move this 4x over to the right side, I see that it's being added over here, so I subtract 4x from both sides of the equation. Okay, because what I do to one side, I have to do to the other side. And I know that I'm left now with a negative 16 equals 6x minus 4x is 2x plus 16. So now I can continue my steps by undoing any addition or subtraction that's being done to my variable. And I see that it has 16 being added to it. So I'm going to go ahead and subtract my 16 from both sides. And I'm left with negative 32 equals 2x. So then I can do my final step and undo any multiplication or division. So I see I'm multiplying, so to undo that, I divide both sides by 2. So I'm left with x equals, and I know that 32 divided by 2 is 16, and it was a negative, so it's going to stay negative. So now I know that my x is a negative 16. So to double check, I could take that x and plug it way back into the beginning piece and just double check my work. So go ahead and take a minute to do that. But we always want to follow these steps. Okay, this is going to be your kind of key guide no matter what. We always start with the distributive property, combine like terms on the same side, get all my variables to the same side, then I'm going to undo addition or subtraction, then I'm going to undo any multiplication or division. So make sure this yellow one kind of sticks with you because you're going to use it a bunch. Okay, we've got one more real thing that I want to talk about in this lesson. So there can be different examples, and you'll have different numbers of solutions. Okay, sometimes equations will have one solution, and sometimes equations won't have any solutions, and you will see that. And here's how we know. Okay, this is just a little key to tell us how many solutions is our answer going to have. Am I going to have one answer? Do I not have any answers that work? If I ever end up with my variable equals something, that's what that box is, that tells me I have one solution. And this is that solution, okay? So if you end up with x or whatever your variable is equals something, that's your solution. Sometimes you'll end up with, after solving, you'll end up with something that looks like 3 equals 3. This is a true statement. These two things are equal. So that tells me that I have infinite solutions. It doesn't matter what I put in for my variable, I'm going to get this same thing, so anything really works. Then my final possibility I would end up with something like this. Now this is not a true statement. 3 does not equal 5. So this tells me that I have no solutions. No matter what I put in for x, it's not going to work. Okay, so I have no solutions there. So now you have one final handout from me today that you're going to be just looking at, and it's just kind of a guide or a cheat sheet. So let me show you what it looks like. It's this one right here. Okay, so what you're going to do is I'll show you kind of what a finished one looks like, is you're going to cut these out, and then you are going to cut along our dotted lines, and cut along our dotted lines in both the top and middle layer. And then when you glue them and tape them together, you end up with a book that looks sort of like this. So you can kind of follow these steps as well, and this gives you a little bit more detail. So are there any grouping symbols? If yes, this is what we do. We do the distributive. If no, we can flip there and says, okay, there's no symbols, go on to my next step. So we're going to kind of follow this flow chart to help us really solve all of these different equations. So now is your time to go ahead and really start working on this homework. We're going to get into some pretty complicated equations. So now you should have the steps and all of the resources that you need to help you solve those and get that variable all by itself. So take a few minutes and make sure your notes are where you want them to be before you dive into your practice and your homework, and let me know whenever you get stuck.